Welcome to our Building State Capability Talk series. Today we have Rakesh Rajani with us here, and he is the president of JustSystems, which it seeks to strengthen and support infrastructure to make public systems effective, inclusive, and dignity affirming in the global south. He brings 25 years of experience in starting and running civil society organizations and 9 years in philanthropy. He was the first vice president of programs at Co-Impact and led its conceptualization of systems change, and the director of civic engagement and government at the Ford Foundation in New York. Previously, Rakesh Rajani founded and served as the head of Twaweza East Africa, an organization that advances citizen agency and open government, and established Uwezo, Africa's largest program to assess basic literacy and numeracy. He has also co-founded and led Haki Elimu, Tanzania's largest citizen engagement and education advocacy organization, as well as Kuliana Center for Children's Rights, which is now defunct. Rakesh is a founding member and past co-chair of the Open Government Partnership and has been a longtime fellow of the Center of Global Development. He has also served on several nonprofit boards, including the Hewlett Foundation, Luminate, IBP, and IPA. He presently lives in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. We're really delighted to have you, Rakesh. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Salimah, and thank you all for coming. It's a real treat to have you here. I'll share some thoughts, and then I'm really looking forward to the conversation. I'm sure you've heard that people say you learn more from failure than success. And I was trying to figure out why. And I think it's probably because if you plan to do something and it succeeds, it just kind of confirms what you know. But if you plan to do something and it fails, then your knowledge has to be stretched because what you know didn't work. Is this loud enough? So what I'm going to try to do is to start off by sharing two stories of failure, or perhaps success, which in fact were failure, and then try to share some of the findings from the research that we've been doing together with Carolina, who is there, who is part of JustSystems, and see if you can put together, and then let's have a conversation. So, one of the first things I did after university back home in Tanzania is to work as an activist to try to reduce the debt load that countries like Tanzania had. At that point, we were paying 42% of all of our revenue in servicing debt, not even paying back. And one of the things we showed is that we were spending 3 times as much on debt servicing as we were spending on education in a country that desperately needed to invest in education. Thanks to that, we contributed to something called HIPIC, that you probably are familiar with, the Highly Indebted Poor Countries Initiative. And that was a deal where if a country made a plan around how they were going to use their debt savings, the debt would be forgiven and that money would be then channeled to good things. In fact, the first time I engaged on it with President Mkapa, who was the president of Tanzania then, was right here at the Kennedy School. There's a guy called Jeff Sachs, you may have heard of, who was supporting him on making Tanzania's plan. So it was funny that Tanzania's plan of what to do was being made at Harvard rather than Dar es Salaam. But I got a chance to spend 3 days with, sleeves up, working out, just a peon on the side, but it was still heady days. Thanks to that, when I went back home, we worked on something on the education component, what was called the Primary Education Development Plan, and then a Secondary Education Development Plan, and had huge influence. We were able to get school fees abolished because we showed that the amount of money coming in for school fees was tiny, something like $8 to $12 million a year, but it was keeping out at least 2 million kids. So here was a thing where you charge something, it brought you very little, but its negative impact was to leave lots of kids. So we abolished school fees. We focused on making sure money got to schools through something called the capitation grant, because we knew that you needed money at the school level if you wanted quality. We strengthened school governance. So we know that governance is really important. by setting up school committees that are more democratically elected. We even made sure students were represented. One boy, one girl were on a school committee. And we also knew that this huge program would need good communication. So we persuaded the planning to have a good kind of communication program so everybody, citizens, government leaders would all be aware of what this program is, its key features, and how they could be part of it. So by any set of objective measures, you could say that was a huge amount of policy and programmatic influence. Now, of course, in implementation, problems started happening. And first was the communication stuff. There was a $2 million budget for it, out of 600 million. So it was relatively small. But the people who are designing it in the Ministry of Education basically wanted to get a whole bunch of T-shirts and boring posters. And we tried to persuade them that that's not a good idea, and they didn't listen, probably because there was also maybe a little kickback in the T-shirt procurement, because each T-shirt cost $6 when we did some quick check and we realized you could probably get them for less than $2. But because we didn't persuade them, then at the kind of big meeting, multi-sectoral meeting where you have lots of government people, some civil society, and the donors who are funding this, we essentially exposed that this was a crappy idea and maybe the money was being not well spent, and that scuttled. So we saw that as a success. We stopped money being wasted on this not so smart communications program. The money that was meant by policy to get to the schools through capitation grant, it's a nice idea. Anecdotally, we could see that the money wasn't getting there, so we managed to commission a study called the PETS, Public Expenditure Tracking Study. That was one of the first big PET studies in education, certainly in Tanzania. And it showed what we felt was true, which was that the money was not kind of bottled up at the central levels and at best the district, but was not getting to the schools. This kind of wonky technical report, we made sure it had wings. We made sure we publicized it, made it popular. We did a simple version of it. It went on media. So not only did the kind of few policy bureaucrats and donors know it, whole country kind of thing. And we used, unlike those boring posters, we used TV adverts and ways to use humor to kind of point out the hypocrisy here. We also showed that the school governance was working by taking, cherry picking, if you will, the best examples of accountability at the school level, where parents, sometimes even students, were showing how their principals, the head teachers, as well as the district level officials, were doing all kinds of procurement around cement, for classroom building or desks at inflated rates, and we ridiculed them. And this was super. There was a lot of humor. People joked about it, and it kind of was rooting for the little guy, right? The ordinary parent, the students. And we were making sure that those pompous government officials couldn't get away with it. This made, and we did this other series where we showed up the kind of hypocrisy of how everybody, all of us who are making these decisions, we sent our kids to private school, which were very different than these public schools. And so Kalma, we kind of pointed out that we were quite happy for other people's children to have these crappy conditions because we could opt out and have better conditions. And that had a huge impact. Those are called Kayumba. To this day, this is more than 20 years later, you go and people still remember these adverts. I personally, and the organizations I was part of, got huge credit. We were seen as, speaking truth to power, showing what the problems were with government, kind of puncturing a kind of pompous balloon, puncturing the kind of lies, if you will, or the rosy stories that the government was telling. Obviously, the government didn't like this. First, they just tried to ignore us and sideline us from the policymaking process. So where we had been very influential at the beginning to shape what the policy would be, now we were kind of put to the side. Then, after ignoring us, but because we kept going, they started attacking us, criticizing us, telling us that our data had no basis, we were making things up, we had no credibility, but we persisted. We showed that in fact the data we were using was largely government data, and our evidence was second to none, and we kept quietly pointing that out, and not quietly as in not with a shrill voice, but very effectively and always in the public domain, so that people would know it. The whole idea was that people know what's going on, they will make sure that they'll put pressure on government and government will do the right thing. This got so bad as far as the government was concerned. There was a time when that same President Kappa, who I had worked with here at the Kennedy School for a few days, went on national television and kind of publicly attacked the organization and publicly attacked me in some very undiplomatic language. And the headlines in the newspapers the next day were final nail in Hakeelimu's coffin, which is the organization I was leading then. There were cartoons with my head through a noose and things of that sort. I got lots of praise as to how courageous I was, how brave, how principled. And the country knew. There was a survey done that showed that 79%, nationally representative survey, including rural areas, remote rural areas, showing that 79% of Tanzanians knew what Hakeelimu was, what it stood for in some of these positions. So by multiple measures, this was huge success. We had stood up to a big government, we had pointed out what was not working, we had stood our ground, and we kept saying what was needed. And we focused on many of the right things. Now, and by the way, the donors loved us. Lots of money kept coming. We had more money than, we had more offers of money than we could accept. Now let's look at this story just from a slightly different point of view. Remember, we started this work because we wanted kids to be in school, showing up to the school and learning. So what happened to those outcomes during this time of our success? School, there were kids enrolled, the names were on a list, but were they actually showing up to school attendance? No. We had put that in the system that attendance should be measured, not just enrollment, but that system was not working. While the children actually learning, we did some other survey work based on what's called Asser in India and Uwezo in East Africa that showed kids were not learning. And even though that data was out there, things didn't change. Did the money through the capitation grant reach the schools? No, it didn't. The problems persisted. What about the effect it had on government, whose practice the pressure was meant to improve? Right. Our very effective use of data and evidence and public communication had the impact of humiliating the government. Whether you are a district level official or whether you are the president of the country and everybody in between, were humiliated. People are laughing at them because we pointed out that their rhetoric was empty and not so powerful. But what did it make them feel? It made them feel humiliated. What did that humiliation do? It made them go on the defensive. They strengthened the muscle of how to defend themselves. Whether it was done credibly or not is a different issue, but their energy went into being defensive and being able to show what they were doing was great, or to try to undermine what they were doing. Said, the energy was now not focused on kids being in school and learning, it was focused on defending their record. And remember, this was also coming up to elections, so the concerns were much more than education. The concerns around how are they going to win the next term. The reformers inside government that we had worked with to do some of these positive changes now had much less space to operate. Because this became, we are under siege. There are these people out there attacking us. So whose side are you on? Are you with those outsiders or are you with us? And there was a kind of allegiance that they had to swear, and they could do very little, because if they tried to do the sorts of things we were talking about, they would be seen as traitors. And perhaps in the long term and most insidiously, what our success did was kind of reinforce the idea that you heard in the Western media, often racist media, and what some of the more neo-colonial minded funders in our country are also having, which is that, when it comes down to it, this African government is corrupt, bureaucratic, ineffective, not to be trusted. We need to keep them on a short leash. Look, after all, we can see all the ways in which these lessons that I'm sharing with you now, this second perspective, is not something that I focused on 25 years ago when this was happening. This is with the benefit of hindsight. So the story I tell you is one of great success, many measures, great recognition. When you look at it in terms of what are the outcomes you said, what is the difference we're trying to make, what is the capability of that government to be able to drive those that meaningful change. In fact, what we do is probably undermining. Let me tell you one more story of failure, and then I'll get to some of the lessons from our research. This other story also starts in the US. I thought I'd share lessons that since I'm speaking with you, that through a set of lucky accidents that includes your new dean, Jeremy Weinstein, who was at the White House then. When Obama became president and he wanted a kind of signature global development initiative, George Bush had PEPFAR, and he wanted to do this. We came up, some of us were involved in that process, and we came up with the idea of something called the Open Government Partnership, which I think is actually a terrific platform. It doesn't get the attention I think it deserves, but it achieves a lot. And the Open Government Partnership, so basically Obama asked his people to come up with ideas, and this is the idea that was chosen by Obama. It was launched by him on the sidelines of the United Nations General Assembly early on in his term, and there was, this small gathering of heads of state, and those were heady days. If you remember the early days of President Obama, everybody was so excited, particularly also in the global South. And I was lucky enough to be able to sit at the same table close to him and be the only, there were like 7 speeches, Obama, 6 other heads of state, and me. Just like this, I've reached my pinnacle. Everything else after that is going to go down. When you're going to hang out with that. And my president, Kikwete, who by the way is speaking here at 6 p.m. today, at that time, he was also very excited. He was kind of surprised that I was getting this form, and he was very excited. And I remember when the thing ended, President Obama was like, kind of came over to me, and Kikwete inserted himself, and he claimed me as one of his own. Like, he's from Tanzania. Do you know what Twaweza means? It means we can make it happen. A little bit like the Obama slogan. And then when we went back, President Kikwete got us to join the Open Government Partnership. He invited me inside cabinet, so I spoke 2 cabinet meetings to explain what the OGP is, how it works, how we made a plan. I ended up kind of essentially being the main architect of that plan, because the way OGP works is you make a plan, you commitments, you co-create that plan, and then you work on it, and then you report on progress, and it's also independent evaluated. So I got to rub shoulders with President Obama. I get to address cabinet in Tanzania. We get to make a plan that has some really amazing features. The plan focused on 2 major things: transparency. How can government be transparent about what it does and what the real situation is? How much money is going where, and all of those sorts of things. And the second part involved public participation. How can citizens actually be involved in everyday governance? Because government should work for people. Again, I was very proud of that work, very proud of what we did. And it was in the plan. In practice, though, even though we had the president behind me, and he launched it, and there was lots of ribbon cutting and lots of good stuff, it didn't quite go so well. Now, because of time, I'll cut through a lot of other parts of how we, but the short kind of conclusion is that transparency had the effect of again making government look bad. We went straight to transparency without working on strengthening the capability of government systems because we focus on the right things, not like when the kids were enrolled, but while they actually learning. The kids were not learning. So as soon as you made the data transparent, it made government. So many people in government understood this wonderful effort as essentially a way of exposing their weaknesses and their failures when they didn't have the resources and the capability to and the kind of wherewithal to change them. The other thing was around public participation. We went from a kind of super authoritarian government post-independence and pre-independence, which was just used to being very top-down, to insert an innovation that was all about bottom-up and citizen engagement without ever building the mindsets and muscles required to do that. And so in practice, people in charge felt this was a challenge to their authority. We talk about kind of patriarchal worlds, kind of ageist worlds where people who are older are kind of used to just having their say and not being questioned. And now we are having students question it because that's what. So it didn't work so well because the whole thing was conceptualized, very well-meaning, but kind of very much top-down with Obama and Kikwete. So I share these stories to you as a way of what I have learned is that you may think you are doing great work, but in fact, you can end up having the opposite effects. Now, a lot of these lessons were recently confirmed when we did a piece of work over 6 to 8 months that involved reviewing 53 initiatives on state capability and systems change, and kind of having 130 long, unhurried conversations with people in government and outside government around what does it actually take to get government to work better for people. So if we can go to those slides, Catherine, there are only 3 slides over there, several points. I'll just walk you through them. So the first one is that, and this is a very high-level summary, right, of hundreds of pages of work, right? Most civil society organizations, philanthropies, and consultancies, whether you are a McKinsey or some of the more boutique ones, don't really understand what makes government tick. They understand the official roles, they understand the laws. What does it actually, the political economy of the bureaucracy, the political psychology of the bureaucracy. And both civil society organizations and government, they demonstrate very little curiosity to understand the government. We are very comfortable in our silence. When I'm an activist out there, we like to lampoon government. And both similarly, people in government also say, oh, those people just make a lot of noise, they shout, they're donor funded. So we kind of wallow in our stereotypes of each other. The second is, and again, a lot of this, you guys at the Kennedy School, you will know this, politics is the biggest determinant of systems change. It's a kind of both small p and capital P politics that matters. But many of us are trained when we think about global development to keep away from politics. Right? No, we don't. India elections. No. We can't talk about that. And what that means is when we shirk that, we really don't understand how accountability would work in practice. Next one. Inclusion. Everybody says is important, especially gender equality or women in leadership. We all have the data. We know how patriarchal our systems are. But when you scratch the surface, there's some attention to numbers, but very little work on kind of underlying drivers of discrimination. They're not really addressed, as well as the deeper manifestations of how do girls and women feel agency when they are in school or when they are running a bureaucracy. There is often great work. There are many feminist organizations doing some incredibly good work, but it rarely has work at scale. So it's almost like exceptions to the rule that kind of show that the rule can't be changed. Fourth one is a kind of very simple point that, and this is the work when we did, for example, the work that Carolina did on looking at many efforts. There's a lot of attention on activities and inputs and even outputs, but very, very little focus on actual outcomes. The kind of activities are fetishized rather than how is that leading to differences. So lots of leadership programs where it's very hard. We talk to people who run leadership programs for 20 plus years, and we say, okay, as a result of that, can you tell us how people's lives have changed? And they struggle to answer that question. And in this, we also saw that there was very little prioritization. We have a kind of epidemic of good stuff happening that actually doesn't add up. Where I think lots of good stuff is probably the enemy of 2 good things well done. Next, and this I think I'm curious what you think about it. Is that capacity is very much thought of as individual skills. Like so many fellowship programs, like let's give them the skills and the connections, rather than trying to understand how does a system either create or erode capacity. How does capability get created? How do the incentives and the motivations of a system get ordinary people and make them really capable and give them agency as opposed. And so what happens is you get often very talented, skilled, capable people who go into a system that kind of strips them of their capability. And then all we do is we find those people and give them more skills, but they go back to the system, and the system erodes, incentivizes capability. And this idea of how do you get a bureaucracy, use that word deliberately, how do you get a bureaucracy to be able to think, to be motivated to think, and function with confidence, is a question that gets very deliberative. Next. This is a really important point, Land Pritchett and others make it, is that if you think of a lot of problems that government have been solving for a while, how do you get teachers deployed, how do you get people paid, how do you get classrooms built, and so on. Those are really important problems, right? And they need to be fixed and refixed. But the nature of the problems, the really big problems we face now around climate change or around, you can get a teacher trained, but what will make her wake up every day and do a good job? How do you solve that problem at scale? That takes deep work, but we don't know how to do the deep work. What we know how to do is shallow work, and that's what gets rewarded and recognized. But what we need to do is kind of deep work. There's people you may know the book Deep Work, and I recommend you reading. The last gap we found is this is on the kind of philanthropic funder side. Is that lots of funding, what it does is it creates hundreds, thousands of projects, labs, ideas, experiments, all kinds of stuff, well-meaning, often good ideas, but the sum effect of that is essentially just creating more noise and distraction from the core system. And if anything, because it kind of distracts you, because it kind of scatters you, fragments your thinking, and fragments the institutional structure there, it may actually undermine the systems change that you're seeking to do. And that kind of also further cynicism, because you come up with all these ideas and they don't get traction. So it kind of reinforces the view, these people are not interested, there's no capability, nothing is going to change. So its actually effect is quite insidious. Now I want to just focus on 5 things in the next slide that when we spoke to leaders, both in government and civil society, they said are particularly missing, and this will kind of echo some of what you've seen before. So first one is getting the technical part right, of course, matters. If you want to teach kids, you need to know how to use the right pedagogy. But the major constraints are political and institutional, not technical. So people get trained to come up with technical solutions, when in fact the problem is not technical at core, it's political and institutional. Next one is that good design, of course, matters. So everybody who is smart knows how to do, focuses on strategy and policy making. Right? That's probably what you guys all get trained to do. Right? But while that matters, the crux of the issue is effective implementation. It's implementation where the rubber hits the road, where lives actually change. And implementation isn't simply a kind of mindless following of the good policy. Implementation needs huge amount of thinking in real time in practice as you need to adapt and pivot all the time. But those muscles are not well trained, and we don't know how to do that. All the smart people just kind of fetishize strategy, policy making, and stay on that side when 90% of the work is on this side. Third, delivery, of course, matters, right? You want to have the blah blah actually make a difference in people's lives. So there should be a focus on delivery, but it's not only delivery all the time. Right? It turns out, and Lilith Tsai at MIT and others have made this point, how people experience public systems really matters. Right? So you go to your health clinic, they don't have medicines because the government has run out of money or its systems are not working. It'll make a huge difference whether that patient is told, get the hell out of here, or just like, why are you bothering us? There's no medicine, get lost, or whether they are treated in a respectful manner where they are explained, look, we don't have medicine, but look, let's think together of what we can do about this. The experience of that people have from government matters, not only to be treated well, nobody likes being treated like shit, but it matters also in terms of how much trust and energy are you going to put into fixing the government system. That is fourth. Oh, okay. Leaders struggle with isolation. Right. You would think that leaders are surrounded by people all the time. The last thing they feel is that, what do you mean isolation? They're with people all the time. But as you're sure you've heard, it's very lonely, especially if you're a reformer trying to do something, especially if you're trying to do something that's different than and what they crave more than money and policy ideas and smart papers that you publish. They just want trusted relate. They want a community of people who understand them. They can talk with, be open, be vulnerable, and engage, and be challenged in a trusted manner. That's really missing. And the civil society side and the government side, but particularly on the government side. And then again, the funding is linked to the distraction point, is that money tends to focus on, like if you think of like a lot of West Coast philanthropy in particular, they'll say, how can I get the biggest bang for this money? Right? So they're kind of thinking around, I have $10 million to spend, or 100 million, or whatever the figure is. What can I do with that amount of money? And that thinking means you focus so much on what 10 million can do that you're not paying attention to the 5 billion that the government is already spending, and how that could be put to better use, and how your 10 million perhaps can focus not on the best buy, but what it can do to help the 5 billion be put to better use. Because even if you can influence 5% of that 5 billion, it's going to be much more than what you're going to be able to do with the 10 million, likely to be influenced. So this is a real problem where I think a lot of well-meaning philanthropy actually does harm by causing lots of noise outside with their money, rather than, and it's also just not very smart in terms of the leverage effect. All right, last slide, and then we get into the discussion. When we said what should be done, we didn't have a kind of one-for-one, like, okay, this problem, fix it like this. Instead, what people said is that what you need is a kind of way of thinking that's different. So don't play whack-a-mole by fixing each problem. That's right. We need to kind of think of how we think about this. So the first, guys, this is a BSc event, so you'll probably like this, is focus on state capability, culture, and practice to get things done well, instead of pushing your solution. We talked to a IAS, Indian Administrative Service Officer in India, who said, this is my day. I wake up in the morning early, and there are files piled on, and there's a line of really smart NGOs, researchers, RCT people, and management specialists lining up, trying to sell me their idea. Each idea is good. I still haven't responded to the 15 ideas that came yesterday by people. Everybody, my life is full of salesmen trying to sell me the shiniest gadget. What I need is nobody is interested in what am I dealing with right now? And I have to deal with stuff, sometimes stupid stuff, like my chief minister is worried, wants me to go on this meeting, or there's a scandal about to break in the newspapers that I need to respond to. It's about a small thing, but it's a scandal. If I don't address it, I'll be fired. And this salesman selling me the shiny things don't help. So don't start with your policy idea. Please, when you leave the Kennedy School, don't start selling policy ideas. Focus on state capability. What matters is a methodology, right? Not a particular idea. It's like essentially a set of questions, a way of thinking, an approach rooted in values and purpose. So those really matter. It's not just strategy. Grounding in values around inclusion, for example, and purpose. The work that Rise did on education. Again, rather than your policy ideas. Next. Real systems change takes deep work, but our environment shallow reward work. When we ask leaders what made them successful, despite all these challenges, invariably many of them said the ability to just stop. Remember, these are incredibly busy people who have long to-do lists. And what they're telling us is that the most important thing they had was the ability to stop, step back, be quiet, and kind of cut out the noise and focus on the one or two things that are the most important. This can sound like a kind of a slightly new agey private practice, And yet what we heard is that this was what they attributed their public success to, the ability to do this. Next. If we and our friends were able to make this change happen, we probably would have done it, right? We are friends, we speak the same language, we hang out, we get together. Most of the big challenges that we have now, we are not going to be able to solve with like-minded. The phrase like-minded has become one of my least favorite terms. It essentially says we're going to just stay in our navel-gazing little club, and that's never going to, especially as our world's become more polarized, like this country is and many other countries. Right? So we need to be able to speak across difference and create winning coalitions, not because we like each other or even agree on a lot of things, but because we realize we need each other to achieve something that we identify as in common, and we develop not only the kind of shared purpose, but also the relationships to get there. 3 more points and then we're done. I hope we can discuss this a lot. We need to reimagine accountability from adversarial, the kind of thing that I peddled in for many years, pointing out the failures of government, to not saying, let's get rid of accountability. No, the purpose of government is people. But how can you reimagine accountability as relational? What Dan Honig, for example, talks about in his Mission-Driven Bureaucrats book, which I highly encourage you to read, as shared responsibility between people and people in government for shared purposes. Sixth, this is a kind of interesting point around, what does it take to make change happen? And we realize that it may not be a Kennedy School degree or your master's or money or ideas of how smart you are. It's really something about sensibilities. And we have a slide, I don't think I have it here, but around what kinds of sensibilities you need, a kind of grounding in purpose, in values, a purpose, a kind of open mind, any fundamentalism, whether you're a religious fundamentalist or a human rights fundamentalist. I think any fundamentalism does not help you do this work, because that means you're so sure you have the answer, perhaps like I was when I told you those initial stories, that you're not open to questioning yourself. And finally, again, around money, you need the right kind of funding. And a lot of the money, whether it's the World Bank or a foundation, is so undermining of systems change. And it's so not focused on how existing much larger resources, both people and money, can be better spent, and to take time to do that, that in fact, it just kind of creates a lot of footnotes on the side, and the main story doesn't change. I want to end by just one reflection. When many countries in Africa became independent, when India became independent, there was a great deal of energy in the 60s, for example, in Tanzania and many other African countries, because we felt we could now run our governments instead of colonial powers. So there was a sense that government is ours. We're going to run it. They're not going to be a bunch of white people from London running it. We're going to run our governments. What has happened now is you don't have that sense. You have a sense that government is there and people are here. There's this kind of othering of government. And there is, whether it's on the left or the right, I think it's across the ideological spectrum, there's this kind of distrust and a suspicion of government, and the sense that government is going to do bad unless you kind of watch out for it or you cut it down to size. So maybe if you're on the right, you say, let's strip government of money, lower taxes, smaller government. If you're on the left, it's like, oh, you can't trust government, better, put all kinds of constraints on it. But the sum effect is this othering of government has, I think, a deeply insidious effect of taking the very institution people need to be able to do good things and other it and make it suspicious and have suspicion of it and make it small. And I think what we need to really question, in ways that I certainly wasn't in the first 20, 30 years of my professional life, is to really question what conceptions we have of government and what effect it has in terms of how we imagine policy and practice. Thank you very much. I hope that was useful. Over to you.